Hello and welcome to the next rankings video. After covering an Imperial, Chaos, and Xenos faction, I figured I would circle back to the Imperium, and of the factions available, the Imperial Guard were the most requested. So without further ado, let's get to it, ranking the Astra Militarum regiments. For those who haven't seen the previous ranking videos, here's the skinny. These videos are not geared to be a top 10 tier list. It's not trying to advocate which subfactions are definitively the best or worst. It instead will paint a picture of each faction's playstyle on the tabletop, demonstrating how each subfaction's mechanics skew. Basically, the goal is to show the differences, which I think is pretty useful for players out there who are looking to build a new army and are curious to see if a particular subfaction will feature a mechanical style to their preference. Before getting started, there are a few things I should point out. There is a notable lack of potency which I can't ignore with a few of the Guard subfactions. This is due to their book being among the early 8th edition codices, when GW didn't really understand the needs of the game. And those subfactions remain in that state because reasons. Also, I've dropped the methodology segment from this video. My rationale here is that I don't want to be repeating the same speech on methodology with every rankings video that gets released, as it needlessly adds to the runtime. Instead, I will only include a methodology segment if there is a change to the process. So if you want to see the methodology used in this video, check out the previous one, link up top. Now, let's head over to the ranked results. So, here's how to read these charts. For those familiar, feel free to jump ahead to the results breakdown. The number beside each chart's label refers to the number of qualifiable mechanics that were able to be evaluated based on the methodology described earlier. Relating to the attribute chart, the two graphs represent army-wide abilities and back-end tools. In the case of the Guard, army-wide refers to their regimental doctrines, and their back-end tools are comprised of their warlord trait, relics, stratagems, and regimental orders. Offensive efficiency relates to mechanics which offer performance increases relating to damage output. Offensive efficiency also informs shooting and melee propensities, so between the three you can read how a subfaction's combat potency and preference skews. Defensive/restoratives are just that, methods to mitigate damage or regain wounds. Flexibility refers to exceptions to core rules, and abilities to restrict enemy play. And it's worthy of note, factions with high flexibility will often have means of mitigating damage through control/restrictions provided by those exceptions. However, unlike defensive qualities, they will require a higher skill floor to leverage. Mobility, in addition to visualizing how fast a subfaction is, importantly informs how effective a subfaction will be able to capitalize on their melee combat potential. And subfactions which score high in flexibility and mobility will typically have a more dynamic playstyle. Relating to the secondary charts, they visualize the number of mechanics that pertain to those areas. Cast and Deny relates to mechanics which enhance reliability, or the amount of attempts which can be performed. Mortal wounds and leadership/morale mechanisms are pretty self-explanatory. To gain some context when looking at how subfactions score, I have compiled the mean averages of all the subfactions' attributes here charted in purple, with the dotted stroke. This is comprised of just the army-wide rules, since those are the rules that almost always carry more weight in characterizing the playstyle of a subfaction. I will be starting off with Cadia, since they are the marketing face of the faction, and take it from there. For Cadia, and for most of the other regiments, the publication used was their current 8th edition codex. Rather appropriately, the regiment which hails from the world where their recruits are raised to be disciplined soldiers take on an aggressive shape. All of the mechanics provided by their regimental doctrine, born soldiers, boost their shooting performance, and results in those areas scoring above the average. When it comes to their back-end tools, Cadia ranks similarly, though to a lesser degree, with small bumps in flexibility and melee propensity, which is mostly due to their warlord trait enhancing the reach of cast orders, leaving their relic, the Relic of Lost Cadia, the overlapping fields of fire stratagem, and the tank order Pound Them to Dust, supporting their offensive focus. Cadia has access to 3 unique units, starting off with Knight Commander Pask, who can be summarized as a named tank commander. He is better than the typical tank commander ballistic skill, starting at 2 up degrading to a 4, and can issue tank orders twice rather than once. Next up we have the legendary commander, Lord Castellan Creed. Creed is a support character who adds flexibility through his tactical acumen. His 2 notable abilities are Supreme Commander, doubling the range of his voice of command and allowing him to use it up to 3 times per turn, and Tactical Genius, granting 2 more command points if he is your warlord. He also has 2 hotshot last pistols, so he scores points in badassery too. Sergeant Kell is an elite character, with Marine equivalent ballistic and weapon skill, and he's armed with a power fist. He has 3 unique abilities. The first, provided by his flag, allows units within 6 inches to reroll failed morale tests. The second allows a single officer within 6 inches to issue another order in each of your turns. And Sworn Protector allows Creed to pass failed wounds off to Kell on a 2-up. On to Catachan. Known for fighting within alien jungles, Catachan take on a shape that also focuses on offensive efficiency but skews heavier towards melee. On the army-wide front, Catachan scores above average in offensive efficiency and melee propensity, thanks to their regimental doctrine Brutal Strength, which grants all infantry +1 to their strength, and it lets vehicles re-roll one of the dice when rolling to determine the number of shots for ranged attacks, which sees them score just below average in shooting propensity. Their doctrine also gives units +1 to leadership when near an officer. Their back-end tools are all attack-oriented, but are more varied. Providing melee support is a warlord trait to intervene 6 inches, along with a relic power sword. Their stratagem inflicts potential mortal wounds when one of their units is charged. And their regimental order, Burn Them Out, allows an infantry unit to reroll the number of attacks with flamer weapons. The jungle fighters have access to 3 character units, 2 HQs and 1 elite. Starting off, Colonel Ironhand Strachan, who I would classify as a combat-oriented company commander. He has their refractor shield, and he is a senior officer, so he can use voice of command twice. But uniquely, he has an aura to give friendly units +1 attack, making him a pretty deadly combatant. He also has an ability enabling him to reroll wound rolls versus monsters, a risky proposition, but handy to have in the right situation. Next we have the infamous Sly Marbo. He's not the most durable, or even that potent in terms of combat. His guns and knife are all damage 1, though they do always wound infantry on 2s. What he does offer is flexibility, the means to arrive from reserves and activate one of 3 specific mechanics. If utilized correctly, he'll accomplish something worthwhile, and perhaps slink back into the shadows to do it again elsewhere in the battlefield. And finally, Sergeant Harker. He is an absolute unit. His heavy bolter Payback is an assault weapon, which thankfully has been improved to the new standard in the Astra Militarum FAQ. He hits on 3s, and his one and only ability is an aura for Catachan units to reroll hit rolls of 1 for shooting. Next up, the Valhallan Ice Warriors, whose chart take on a pretty unique shape. On the army-wide front, the Valhallan regiments score only in flexibility. Their regimental doctrine, Grim Demeanor, offering 2 perks. The first lessens the models which flee from combat attrition tests, and the second allows vehicles with a damage table to double their number of wounds for the purpose of determining their variable stats, which ultimately leaves little for the infantry to take advantage of. Their unique back-end tools offer perks in a variety of areas. Their defensive warlord trait offers a 5-up Feel No Pain, or a 6-up if they are a vehicle. Their stratagem, Send in the Next Wave, lets you set up a destroyed unit within your deployment zone. Though, just like with High Fleet Hydra, it was FAQ'd to require the use of reinforcement points. YGW hasn't FAQ'd both of those to function like Tide of Traitors or Green Tide, so they can at least have some use in the interim is beyond me. And the Valhallan Relic is an improved bolt pistol, which has the added benefit where units within 6 inches can never lose more than 1 model as a result of a single failed morale test. Which, as far as I can tell, is a non-plus, as morale test casualties are already capped at 1, and with morale casualties almost always being a low-grade threat, and the Valhallan regimental doctrine is already alleviating morale casualties, I can't help but ask myself,
but why? Why would you do that?
There is one mechanic I qualify as valid exclusive to the Valhallan Ice Warriors. Their regimental order, Fire on My Command, allows a unit to shoot at enemies engaged with your units, which in isolation is great. It adds some unique flexibility and speaks to their grim demeanor far better than their regimental doctrine does. It doesn't excuse the overall pale toolkit and lack of updates, but I would be remiss to exclude it. Almost every faction has an expert crafting or quality gear subfaction. Space Marines have Salamanders, Necrons have Zeracon, and the Astra Militarum have the Vostroyan Firstborn. On the army-wide rules front, Vostroyan take a shape identical to that of Cadia. Their regimental doctrine, Heirloom Weapons, allows units to add 6 inches to heavy and rapid-fire weapons if they have an initial range of 24 inches. On the back end, Vostroyan have a pretty good spread of abilities, scoring in every area but movement. Their warlord trait allows the bearer to reroll failed hits and wounds in melee. Their relic is a suit of armor that brings the bearer up to toughness 4 with a 2-up armor save. Their stratagem, Firstborn Pride, allows a unit to add 1 to hit rolls. And their regimental order, Repel the Enemy, allows a unit to fire at enemy units which are in their engagement range. Which, like what I said for Valhallan's order, is a nice exception to have for an army that prefers shooting. Moving on to the Steel Legions of Armageddon, who take on a diamond shape skewing evenly towards offensive efficiency, shooting, and defense. Their regimental doctrine, Industrial Efficiency, increases the rapid-fire threshold to 18 inches for infantry units, and vehicles can treat attacks received with AP1 as 0. Their Warlord trait enhances combat potential, granting +1 attack and the ability to add 1 to wound rolls in melee. Their Relic is a mask that lowers the leadership of units within 3 inches by 1, and if they're orcs it can be lowered by 2. What more can be said? Thankfully, their stratagem and regimental order speak to the mobilized infantry element of their namesake. Their stratagem gives a unit which disembarked the ability to reroll hit rolls of 1, and their order allows a unit to embark onto a transport after shooting. I can't speak to the practicality of such a strategy, but it's a pretty cool flex. Next up, the Desert Raiders of Talarn, who take on a pretty distinct shape, spiking outwards on shooting propensity, mobility, and flexibility. Their doctrine, Swift as the Wind, encourages a more mobile style of play, allowing infantry to maintain their quality of fire with the majority of weapon types, and gives their vehicles the ability to treat heavy weapons as assault when advancing. Looking to their back-end rules, they possess multiple mechanics to enhance mobility and flexibility. A fallback and charge aura Warlord trait, a relic power sword, a less restrictive outflanking reserve option via stratagem, and a regimental tank order to shoot and move, or move and shoot, which for me solidifies Talarn as the most dynamic of the regiments. And finally, the Mordian Iron Guard. They skew in offensive efficiency and defense. Although, this comes with a but. Mordian is another regiment which really pains me, mostly because there is something it offers I quite like. The Mordian Iron Guard have probably one of the cooler subfaction rules within the Guard. Their regimental doctrine, Parade Drill, requires you to position all the infantry models touching at least one other model in the unit. Like, holy shit, here we have rules being regulated by model placement. I think it's a big deal, as the vast majority of rules are just passively active. And for the proud, parade-drilled Mordian infantry, it's certainly thematic. Keep in mind though, it is a restriction, notably resulting in that unit not being able to string out, which for board control and reaching to touch objectives does hurt. So what is the perk for this limiting restriction? +1 to leadership, and +1 to hit in Overwatch. That is not an equal trade-off at all. It was bad when Overwatch was free in 8th edition.
It's so bad.
Their Warlord trait and Relic are pretty bland, giving a 4-up layer of protection to nearby units which flee from morale, and giving the bearer a 4-up Feel No Pain respectively. Their stratagem Volley Fire causes a unit's hit rolls of 6 to trigger additional shooting attacks, which is decent and is much closer to a substantial trade-off for Parade Drill than what they have presently. And Mordian's regimental order allows an infantry unit to target characters with rapid-fire weapons, which in isolation does add some flexibility, as it's a pretty potent exception. All said, if things were different, Mordian might be the finesse regiment, requiring a skilled hand to orchestrate precision tactics. But currently, their perks don't justify their demands. And last, we have the Death Corps of Krieg, who uniquely pull their rules from the Forge World Imperial Armor Compendium. Despite their ranking in shooting, flexibility, and melee, I have grievances with Krieg. For starters, let's look at their regimental doctrine, Cult of Sacrifice. The first perk allows units to ignore combat attrition modifiers. The second perk only applies to characters and vehicles, and only functions when they are destroyed, and for vehicles only if they don't explode, and only if you roll a 4-up. So for a single use perk, under all those restrictions, what will this god tier mechanic be? They can make a single melee or shooting attack.
You fucked it up!
And what we are left with is a subfaction rule that gives all your infantry a low-grade morale-oriented defensive perk, and lets each character and vehicle make one extra shooting or melee attack on death 50% of the time except for when vehicles explode, which honestly feels like a chapter tactic from the start of 8th edition. I'm surprised the building keyword isn't worked in here somewhere. And keep in mind, This A+ regimental doctrine is where Krieg's subfaction rule support ends. No warlord trait, no relic, no stratagem or regimental order for the fan-favorite regiment. As a boon of sorts, Krieg do have a surplus of unique units, and as a change of pace, none of them are named characters. Although my understanding is, a large portion of their units have been axed. So... in any case, what you have on those unique units is a better than standard ballistic skill, and possessing a few units which are mounted, which lend themselves obviously to increasing your mobility, but also possessing a pretty good melee performance, and coming with outflank reserve options. Here are the 8 core regiments, and as is customary, let's rank order them per attribute. Here they are organized by most efficient. Here they are organized by most flexible, most defensive, most mobile, by melee propensity, and by shooting propensity. As a bit of a bonus, I figured I would also do a quick assessment on the Special Op Tempestus regiments, which thankfully have rules written much closer to the present acceptable standard, so it should serve as a decent palate cleanser. The elite shooting forces of the Tempestus regiments are for the most part all shooting centric, so let's blast through them. Let's jump in with the Stormtroopers, who serve as our vanilla Tempestus regiment, rules found in the core Astra Militarum Codex. Their doctrine provides them what is essentially death to the false emperor, but with shooting, and only if they are within half range. Their back-end tools do add some flexibility, but from what I gather, all the Tempestus regiments have access to the Tempestus relic, warlord trait stratagem, and order present in the core codex. And since these assessments are designed to show the differences, let's move along. The first of the new Tempestus regiments are the 54th Scion Jackals, whose rules, like with all the following Tempestus regiments, are found in Psychic Awakening: The Greater Good. The Scion Jackals are the Hunt from the Dark, intimidating, morale-centric regiment, their doctrine doubling the enemy kill count for the purposes of their morale tests. Their back-end tools offer a good spread: a tricksy redeploy thanks to their warlord trait, a beefed-up chainsword relic, and a stratagem to give a unit of yours a -1 to hit buff versus enemy shooting attacks. On to the 32nd Thetoid Eagles. The Thetoid Eagles take on a shooting-focused triangle shape like the Stormtroopers. Their doctrine, Predatory Strike, works just like that of the Stormtroopers, but it's essentially superior. Where the Stormtroopers' hit rolls of 6 allow you to make an extra attack, the Thetoid Eagles' hit rolls of 6 count as an additional hit, no rolling required. Their back-end tools follow in step, oriented for shooting. A warlord trait that bumps nearby units' hotshot weapons to AP4 on wound rolls of 6, a mortal wound dealing last pistol relic, and a stratagem to let a Turox Prime reroll hits. Next up, the 133rd Lambdan Lions. They are the Tempestus regiment who have close ties to the Mechanicum, granting them access to superior war gear. The Lambdan Lions also take on the shooting-focused triangle shape, however they skew outwards towards melee as well. Their doctrine, Prized Weaponry, grants all weapons, melee included, an additional point of AP, although as a Tempestus regiment, they will be shooting more often than not. Their back-end tools showcase their exclusive gear, and provide them with added offensive and defensive measures. A warlord trait to reroll 1s to hit in shooting for units nearby, a relic shield generator to provide units with a 5-up invulnerable save, and a stratagem to provide some mortal wound output from hotshot weapons which wound on 6s. Next we have the 43rd Iotan Dragons. They are another Tempestus regiment specializing in offensive efficiency and shooting mechanics. Their doctrine, Crack Shots, increased the range of rapid-fire weapons by 6 inches. Differentiating them from the Thetoid Eagles, of their 3 unique back-end tools, 1 serves as a defensive measure. Their warlord trait denies an enemy target cover benefits, their relic is a beefed-up plasma pistol, and their stratagem improves Overwatch to be successful on 4s. Moving on to the 55th Capic Eagles, who take on a refreshingly distinct shape. The Capic Eagles are the swift Tempestus regiment. Their doctrine, Mobilized Infantry, lets units ignore the heavy weapon move and shoot penalty, and grants units which disembark from transports the ability to add 1 to their hit rolls. On the back end, the Capic Eagles have some boons to flexibility and defense. A warlord trait that allows the warlord to issue orders while embarked, and boosts their voice of command range to 24 inches. A relic to half the enemy charge distance, and a stratagem that can debuff an enemy unit with a -1 to hit modifier. And finally, we have the 9th Iotan Gorgons, who notably have close ties to the Sisters of Battle. The Gorgons take on that familiar offensive shooting oriented shape, thanks to their doctrine Absolute Heroism, granting infantry exploding hits on 6s if they target the closest enemy. On the back end side of things, the Iotan Gorgons score in shooting, offensive efficiency, mobility, and high in flexibility. This is in part to a relic bolt gun capable of targeting characters that also deals bonus damage to psychers, as well as a stratagem allowing units arriving from reserves to be set up outside 5 inches from enemy models rather than the standard 9. And they have a warlord trait that will force psychers to suffer perils of the warp on any doubles if within 24 inches. And here are the 6 Tempestus regiments. I omitted the core codex's stormtroopers, since they are largely invalidated by the Thetoid Eagles. So let's do some quick-fire comparisons. Here they are organized by most efficient, by most flexible, by most defensive, most mobile, by melee propensity, and by shooting propensity. Well, that's a wrap on this one. Thanks for watching. These were my assessments/rankings on the Guard and Tempestus regiments, and it was quite a doozy. Hopefully it wasn't too ranty, but I just can't help getting worked up when looking at some of the rules in those old books. But tell me, what's your take on it? Am I blowing things out of proportion? Or perhaps maybe I overlooked something. In any case, I hope you were able to find this video interesting if not enjoyable. And if you have any questions or comments, feedback or suggestions, please drop them down below. So, if you enjoyed this video, there's a like button. And if you want to help this channel grow, there is a subscribe button. There is also a bell button and a share button, so press the buttons you want to press. Thanks again for watching, and I'll hope to see you guys in the next one.